Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Learning Lunch hosted by Format Approved. My name is Brian Johnson. I'm the Senior Director of Online Education with Format Approved, and I'll be your moderator for today's session. Today's session is called HIPAA Compliance and Cloud Computing, and we're very happy to have an expert in cloud computing and IT security. Charles Killmer of Netgain is with us today, and so I really look forward to this session. Thank you for joining us today, Charles.
Absolutely.
Well, I'll leave the screen up there so you can see a little bit about Charles' experience as I tell you that as we go through this session today, you can ask questions of our expert at any time. I certainly encourage you to do so because it's a rare opportunity to get your security questions answered. We're going to tend to hold those questions until the end, so type those into the chat area. We'll save them and then we'll share them with our expert. And if we run out of time on any of those, we will allow him to answer those in writing to you. So don't worry if we don't get to your question during the live event. We will answer all of them. And here's a look at the questions we're going to cover today. I'll let you look at that while I mention that people always ask us if they can get the slides and the recording of the event. Don't worry about that either because both will be sent to you shortly after the conclusion of the event. It takes us a little time to render the video and get everything prepared for you. But sometime this afternoon or early tomorrow, you'll receive all of those materials. So don't worry about getting your hands on those, and you can pass those on to other colleagues you think might be interested. All right, so that's enough of looking at the questions, enough introduction. Let's get to our event. So thank you again for joining us today, Charles. And I think the first question is a great introduction in itself because people talk about the cloud all the time, but I think, a lot of us may not know what it really is. So what is the cloud?
Sure. So while definitions vary, one thing that I feel is important to understand is that other than its size, there's very little difference between any company's internal network and the larger internet. From the internet's perspective, all of our offices are part of the internet's internal network. You can think of an ISP like Charter, similar to how you think about any computer in your office. An analogy that I feel really conveys the structure of the internet is that of our homes and neighborhoods. The city is like the internet with many connected neighborhoods. The neighborhood like an ISP with many connected houses. Your house is like an individual computer connected to that ISP. If you need a cup of sugar, you can walk to your neighbor's house. Similarly, if your company needs their email hosted, you can buy that service from someone in your neighborhood or anywhere in the world for that fact. Buying that service from somewhere else on the internet is what they call cloud computing. The servers that provide the service are specifically designed to be used over a network. They don't really care that they're not in your office. They'd work just fine in any network. The cloud imagery is mostly used to remove all the detail of how these large networks work together. These networks have an incredible amount of technology to make them work as well as they do, but at the core of it, they're simply connected or simple ways of connecting people to services around the world. With that understanding of the internet, it becomes easy to see that there are three options for cloud computing. Either those services are completely outside of your office, or they can be completely inside your office, or some combination of the two. These different types are referred to typically as public, private, and hybrid clouds. Different levels of integration are possible with each. Typically, if you have some information that you need to keep extremely tight control of, think government documents, they'll keep that on the portion of that cloud provider that's strictly internally accessible only.
That's interesting. So you can have secure files that are essentially in the cloud, and I like that your definition breaks down this idea of the cloud, that it's some distant thing when really it's all related in the way that you described, and I love the metaphor of the city as well. But regarding the last thing you said, so you can have things that are in the cloud that are still only accessible to the internal organization. Is that fair to say?
Yep, absolutely. Yep.
Okay. Well, DNS I see is your second point there. Can you tell us more about that?
So DNS, the abbreviation is for domain name system or domain name server, depending upon who you ask. It's how computers translate the names we know, google.com, to an address. An analogy that I love for this is it's like a phone book. You don't know necessarily where what my street address is. But if you know my name and what city I live in, you can look in the phone book and find that address. The post office doesn't care about what my name is. They only care about the address. So people, when they're sending a letter, have to translate my name to my address before handing it to the post office. Similarly, the computer has to translate it from the name we know, google.com, to the IP address, Internet Protocol, if you care about the acronym there, the technology, the computer address that google.com is actually living at.
All right. Well, then what about hosted applications?
Sure. So that leads a little bit into the next one. In the cloud, we can host many different applications. I think we'll talk about that a little bit in the next question.
All right. And you've touched on it a little bit anyway. So when it comes to applications, can the cloud host more than a single application for an office? I mean, how does that work?
Sure. So many services are single application only. If you think about the origins of Google.com, they did web searching only. They've obviously grown and now offer many services. As technology has grown, hosting business applications that were designed to be run on a desktop has become a more popular option. Desktop as a service, or DaaS as it's mentioned, that's the ability to run your complete Windows desktop and all the needed applications from somewhere in the internet. You log in, you don't get a web interface to a Windows desktop. You get a Windows desktop that covers your entire local Windows desktop. From a passerby's view of your desktop, it looks like everything is running locally. In our experience, nearly every application is a good fit for hosting with a cloud service provider. Historically, CAD programs or computer-assisted drawing were tough in a hosted environment due to their highly detailed image files. But as bandwidth has increased and remote viewing technologies have gained efficiencies, even these programs can work well in a hosted environment.
Well, that's interesting, and I know we're going to talk a lot about some of the advantages involved with desktop hosting. I think, it's an idea that as more people become aware of the possibilities of it, they're going to really move more and more in this direction because of all the advantages. But, so just to make it clear for folks, it looks as if you're just using any other computer that, has all your information on your hard drive, your operating system and everything. It looks like that, but actually, and not that it really makes any difference, but it's off in the cloud. It's being run on a server that's not in your office.
Yeah, true. A lot of computers that people have under their desks are a lot more powerful than they need to be for accessing a remote desktop in that fashion.
Uh-huh.
The remote desktop, the server on the other end in the cloud, does all of the processing. So the computer that's needed under a desk is now does not need to be very strong or powerful anymore. People refer to thin clients. Those are pretty stripped down computers, low processors, low RAM, enough to do what they need to do, and that is connecting to that remote environment.
Right, and I know there's some really important security advantages that we'll talk about here in a moment. In fact, well, let's get into Hipaa now, if you don't mind. So I'm sure our audience knows about the Hipaa security rule and all of its requirements for protecting electronic data. How can cloud hosting help with that?
Sure. So being that the Hipaa security rule applies directly to electronic health information, in the absence of cloud hosting, all of the security rule controls need to be implemented and audited by the covered entity. When a covered entity contracts with a cloud hosting provider and signs that business associate agreement, the cloud provider must implement the security rule around any EPHI within that hosted environment. The covered entity still must audit to verify that controls have been implemented, but the actual task and cost of implementing them has largely been moved to the cloud. Additionally, the cloud provider will have the ability to consult and educate on Hipaa security rule compliance. That's due largely to the number of clients they likely have, and they should have some professionals that are staying up to date on Hipaa compliance and learning as they grow. In my experience, some of the areas that many businesses need better protection are around the areas of defending against malware and detecting when it's present. inappropriate access to the EPHI should still be handled through audits of the EHR by the covered entity, but the hosting provider should have many more layers of defense against malware. Typical office defenses have a firewall and a spam filter and antivirus. Companies need more layers, in my opinion, including application whitelisting and at least an intrusion detection system. Intrusion prevention systems are a little bit more preferred but harder to configure.
Well, I love this term, application whitelisting. Could you explain to our audience what that is and why it offers you such an advantage in security?
Absolutely. This is a real fun part in my job. Application whitelisting differs from antivirus in a fundamental way. Antivirus maintains a list of all of the bad stuff that's known. If it sees an application starting, it will compare that application and check if it's in the list of bad stuff. If it doesn't think it's bad, it assumes it's good and lets it run. So that introduces an issue where new malware doesn't yet know that it's bad, or it doesn't yet know that new malware is bad, so it lets malware run. That's become a larger problem with the prevalence of new malware every day. And a lot of people don't know the number, but different numbers or different reporting agencies say it's upwards of around 400,000 new pieces of malware every day.
Wow.
So antivirus companies around the world need to update all of their client software with 400,000 new definitions every day. So it's a very difficult system to maintain, and a lot of that new malware gets passed because they simply can't keep up with identifying every single one of those. The number from other agencies is that 40% of that new malware is accurately detected as malware from day one. Now in day 2 and day 3, the antivirus companies, Kaspersky, F-Secure, McAfee, they'll catch up, but they all suffer about that same 40%.
Yeah, that's not
application whitelisting. No, it's pretty bad. 6 times out of 10 they win.
Yeah.
Application whitelisting takes the opposite approach, and it maintains a list of known good stuff. Now, internally to any organization, you don't need to know all of the software out there that's good. You just need to list the software that you care about is good. So things like your EMR, you'd whitelist that. Other applications that you use or that your EMR depends on, Microsoft Office, Word, Outlook, you'd whitelist those. If you don't use Notepad, you don't need to whitelist it. You can leave that unwhitelisted and the system will block it, and if you never are supposed to use it, you won't care. So it makes a much smaller, less changing list of things to update. And then the system reacts in a way that if it's in the whitelist, it lets it run. If it's not in the whitelist, it doesn't let it run. So all 400,000 of those new pieces of malware are not in the whitelist and get blocked.
Okay, so yeah, that was the cash out I was going to ask about. It turns out then that malware is going to appear as some kind of unauthorized piece of software.
Yep, simply as an effect of not being listed in the whitelist.
Well, I think you can see, or anyone should be able to see, how that would really bring a lot of advantages when you've got this kind of difficult security environment that we face these days. If you can just say these are the programs that are allowed and forbid everything else, it seems to be a much stronger posture to me.
Yep, and all of the crypto ransomware that has been plaguing the market over the last year and a half, all of that is unauthorized.
Yeah, so ransomware, for people who may not know, that will lock down, it will encrypt your data, and then you have to pay them a bribe to get the key so that you can get your own data back. I think most people have heard of it these days, but, it's still going around. It's still out there, and new versions keep coming out. And, if you lose control of your data, if it's EPHI, that's a violation in itself. So you've got to get that data back one way or another. Anyway, let's continue then, because you mentioned how a cloud hosting service, for example, or, someone who's doing desktop hosting, that they're going to have people who are up on Hipaa. I assume that they're a business associate, and so they would then, have experts who understand security and can help with Hipaa. Tell us more.
So in terms of the question here, can they address all of the HIPAA security rule? The cloud provider can't address all of the HIPAA security rule.
Mm-hmm.
The only way that would work is if the covered entity would no longer have any technology left in their office. That doesn't really work ever. The clinics and offices still need computers to connect to that cloud provider. This results in the EPHI being copied to the local workstation, at least so that the monitor can display it.
Mm-hmm.
A common misconception is that if they interact with the information in the remote hosted desktop, that their local computer and network are not involved in the compliance standard. But considering that the local computer needs to get the information in order to display it on the screen, as also the local computer needs to get the information from the keyboard in order to send it to the cloud. The information or passwords that are provided in that way could be impacted by malware that would be installed on that local computer.
Mm-hmm.
It could harvest any passwords or any other information. Additionally, the entire network that that local computer is on is also considered in scope, unless they have firewalls all over the place. The security rule also stipulates how employees need to interact with the PHI. That's largely governed by policy and education on the covered entity side. The cloud provider could help in this area, but again, that would likely be a consulting arrangement.
Well, those are great points you make. HIPAA is never going to be a completely technological solution in any case, as you said. So much of it is about policy and education and the administrative side of things that people always need to understand that is going to be there forever. So we haven't talked about the privacy rule yet, but how can cloud hosting help a company with it?
So on the privacy side, less so than the security rule side. The privacy rule applies directly to covered entities. The cloud provider may have resources to help with understanding and implementing the needed controls to satisfy the privacy rule, but outside of a consulting engagement, the privacy rule will still require actions from that covered entity. There are many more things about patient notices,
right,
how employees access it, the other privacy requirements within it.
So that just speaks to the point you made in the last slide as well, that there's never going to be a completely technological solution to compliance, but there can be many advantages to taking a different approach.
Mm-hmm.
I'd just like to remind our audience before we go on, if you do have questions for our expert today, please don't hesitate to ask those. Just type them right into your chat area. We'll save them until the end of the presentation, and then we'll share them with our expert. Okay, so when it comes to meaningful use, how can cloud hosting help achieve the objectives?
So while meaningful use has quite a variety in the requirements, the cloud provider may have beneficial insight due to their exposure to many other organizations. Some of the requirements will require technical solutions, which the cloud provider can certainly help with. Others may not have technical solutions, but the cloud provider may have economies of scale that can provide significant benefits. The cloud provider should also conform to standards and periodic certifications, and that can ease the process of verifying that the cloud provider is secure.
Well, that was something that I almost asked about earlier, and I don't know if I'm stepping on a slide that's coming later, but in terms of economies of scale, it seems like, that's got to be one of the big advantages of using cloud services, is that a practice is never going to have, if it's a small practice, it's never going to make sense for them to have, an IT expert on your level, let's say, or anyone really who knows very much about IT security, because that's not what they're there to do. But if you've got a bunch of those practices hosted in the cloud, then it does make sense to have that kind of expertise on hand. Could you say a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. I look at it from any business that starts up. When it's a small mom and pop shop, the few people that work there do everything from running the tills and balancing the books.
Right.
As organizations get larger, they start to get more specialists in every area. So instead of being a jack of all trades, master of none, they have many masters. Any individual client can take advantage of a cloud hosting provider. Because of their size, they can have many masters and provide access to those masters at a lower monthly cost in a hosting arrangement.
Well, I think that that is one of the big advantages that people should think about, is that you would have that security expertise without having a full-time staffer to pay for.
Absolutely.
Well, let's talk about performance risk then. So we've talked about some of the good things that the cloud provides, but what is the largest performance risk to hosting in the cloud?
So when discussing performance in any computer system, I think it's crucial to keep an eye on the four main components of any computer system. You've got a processor that processes all of the information, memory for short-term storage, hard drives for long-term storage, and the network. Typically in any cloud hosting environment, they will have very large computers distributed to handle the many workloads that are asked. This requires them to have some amount of free capacity to handle bursts from any individual client. Therefore, these four components are sized to handle much more work than any single client would typically create. These four items can still create a performance issue for a client, but this is typically due to the resources that are currently allocated to a client server. If the server needs to use more than has been allocated, that limitation will result in a performance issue. In the hosted environment, that can typically be resolved quickly by changing the resources and rebooting the server. This may also incur additional cost, which can slow remediation time depending upon how contracts are written and how quickly it can be approved. This needs to be ahead of time. This does provide a faster resolution than an on-premise solution. If you run out of resources on an internal server, that typically requires ordering more RAM or ordering more storage or a faster network connection, and that can take time to allocate. Performance issues will arise in the hosted environment, but in my experience, many of them are caused by programming errors in the software that the cloud provider is hosting. A new version of an EMR may have bugs or features that result in performance issues. This is not an issue with the platform, but an issue with the software on that platform.
That's interesting.
The next area that often creates a performance issue is the client's local network connection. The quality of any hosted experience will depend greatly on the quality of that network connection. The cloud provider should be able to help in right-sizing that network connection through their experience, and may even have methods to monitor it for you or provide lower-cost connections to their data center.
So, okay, so if I'm hearing you right, there's two main issues that could come up. Well, there's three, I suppose. But the first one you talked about is, more a question of allocating resources. It almost sounds like, not to oversimplify or at the risk of that, but if it's almost like, pushing a button that you can reallocate resources within a cloud environment where you can't do that locally. But then beyond that, I thought it was really interesting that you said that so often performance issues are actually linked to applications. So it must be difficult sometimes for the providers to understand what's going on if they're having a performance issue. I assume that the cloud service provider then can help them figure out what's causing the performance issues.
Yeah, some cloud providers will act and really partner with the client to treat themselves more like an external IT department. And that would allow them to take more control of that vendor relationship, have a more direct relationship with that EMR provider, and identify where the performance issue is. If it results in a bug, they can release a patch. If it results in a new performance need, that can get addressed quickly in the cloud.
Well, and obviously if it's a problem with the application, you're not going to be the only practice complaining about issues involved with the update.
Certainly shouldn't be.
Yeah. Well, and then the other point you made, I think, is it seems like a pretty obvious one, but it's obviously key to cloud computing. This question of how much bandwidth do you have into the local environment. I'm sure that is something that people have to adjust to. How, I don't know if we're going to get into this here in another slide. I always jump ahead a little bit, but before we go on, you said that the cloud hosting service or that the cloud company could help the practice determine how much bandwidth they need. And then they would just work with their ISP or whatever to get the right amount of bandwidth. Is that correct?
Yeah, typically it gets broken down into a general bandwidth needed per employee or per user that'll be accessing the system. So based on the number of users, you can get a real good ballpark for how much bandwidth they'll need. Typically, it's not working with their ISP to make sure that bandwidth is available. Typically, on our side at least, I can't speak for everybody, there are other private telecom options to get a faster, more robust connection at a lower cost due to other points of presence around the nation.
All right. Well, that's interesting. So we've kind of started to touch on this a little bit. How do the costs of this compare to a more traditional on-premise approach?
So some recent imagery that I've been exposed to that I really like for visualizing this question is that of an iceberg. In an on-premise hosting scenario, the costs look low due to the low cost of capital expense in purchasing the hardware. Below the surface is the operating expense of implementing training, licensing, maintenance, employees, DR planning, downtime response, and other things. Compared to the cloud hosting, where the operating expense is what's shown without any capital expense. All of the capital and operating expense are wrapped into a nice monthly cost. Finance teams prefer this, as IT budget planning is greatly simplified. Their future planning is simple because the monthly operating expense should not change much, and depending upon the contract, may be locked in for some period of time. Contracts vary, but a typical contract will have a lock-in on the per-user rate. Then any monthly fluctuations are due to changes up or down in the employee count. This results in the cost growing only when the client grows or when the client's contract is renewed. Other things could affect the bill if they need more resources on a server in the contract prices per resource type. Then that could result in an increase. But those tend to be pretty small month-to-month changes.
Well, that's a great way to price it. That makes it even simpler than I realized it was. When you say aggregated cost, what's the issue there?
Where was that?
That's your second bullet there. So you've got a stable monthly cost. I assume that's then, over time, what does it cost?
Sure. So the aggregated cost is just aggregating all of the different costs of hosting this type of a structure into one monthly fee.
Right.
So instead of having to plan for an employee or plan for monthly or yearly trainings to manage their software or hardware, now you just pay a cloud provider a single monthly fee, and all of those costs are aggregated into one.
Yeah, boy, the convenience and simplification of it is appealing, I have to say. So are there any disadvantages to using the cloud? What could disappoint people, I suppose?
Two big names in my mind, and again, I'm on the security side, so that's where I tend to focus.
Sure.
Accessibility, that sounds a little odd. The cloud provider is likely accessible to the entire internet. As such, it is now an option for hackers in any country. While your office prior to the cloud provider was likely connected to the internet, you likely had fewer services available to the internet. There are ways to implement the system so that even when that access is present, it's still a very hard layer to get through. But that accessibility is something that needs to be considered. If a client would want to limit their access to a specific location, that's an option. But in my experience, many clients like the ability to log in and check email and check on things when they're vacationing in Germany.
Right.
There's a difficulty in limiting that accessibility once it's opened. On the side of inaccurate exceptions, that's the other point that I looked at. If a business requires a specific compliance standard like Hipaa, that business must not assume that the hosting provider is Hipaa compliant. The provider may not be expecting any medical data and may not configure the services in a fashion that complies with Hipaa. Discussing this error of expectations after everything has been converted is a very fortunate position to be in. The hosting provider may not have the means to provide that compliance, which then would mean you have to leave that provider, could increase costs and other costs of exiting the contract early.
Well, I'm going to jump in if you don't mind, because I do a lot of our HIPAA education here at Format Approved. And I've got to say, if you're the covered entity in that situation, you have really goofed. It's not the cloud provider's fault in that case, because you certainly need to make sure that you're going with a service that understands HIPAA and will meet your compliance needs in that regard. You can't just go out and pick some random group. You've got to make sure that they understand HIPAA and can meet your needs in that way. Because if you do that, it's not the cloud service that's breaching that PHI potentially.
Right.
It's you who's done it.
Yeah, absolutely. For a while, until recently, the last year or two maybe, Google was holding out on signing business associate agreements, and their terms of service were written in a way that said, "Thou shalt not store HIPAA data with us."
Right.
They've come around and they do sign HIPAA business associate agreements, but now the terms of service are still pretty explicit on which apps or which services Google offers provide HIPAA compliance. So there's still that terms of service that must be read to verify that you aren't using one of the Google options or services with medical data, because they are explicitly saying that's not supported, that's not compliant, don't store it there. If you do, you're on the hook.
Right, and I have to imagine that's pretty common for services to say, look, we're not, unless you explicitly sign a BA with us, we don't want your PHI. Don't do it without telling us, please.
Right, and in my opinion, they didn't need to say any of that.
Yeah.
Absence of saying they're compliant, I think, is indication that they're not.
Right.
But I think enough people assumed they were that they took the approach of making it explicit that they are not.
And to be clear, when we're talking about Google in this regard, you can sign a BAA with them if you use their business apps. You can't use Gmail as your HIPAA email service. That's never going to happen. You need to use their business apps, and then they'll sign a BAA with you.
Right. And you can get the email portion through the business apps.
Right.
So technically, it's still Gmail, but it's
not the free consumer
Gmail
version.
account.
Yeah.
Right.
All right. So how can a business address the risks of being globally accessible? You sort of mentioned that a little bit earlier.
So within the hosted environment, firewalls, intrusion detection systems, intrusion prevention systems, vulnerability scanning, many different layers of defense can help restrict that access. Improving security at the client side is also an option, but in terms of the hosting provider, they can, as I mentioned a little bit before, work with the client on restricting access from internet sources as much as possible. The part that really makes me, the part that I spend a lot of my time on is staff education. That's, to me, one of the most important things. Computers historically, in late 90s, early 90s, and before, and a little bit in the early 2000s, used to be the weak point in a network. Now that security has been greatly improved in the computers, attackers have turned to the next weakest link, and that's us. They target us through phishing attacks. Those are malicious emails that typically contain an attachment or a link to some website. Opening the attachment or clicking the link provides an opportunity to that hacker to get some piece of malware installed on that computer. Educating your staff, ensuring that they know about the threats and how well disguised they can be is crucial. Encouraging the employees to report when they fall victim to an attack is also crucial. These criminals are simply looking for money, either by selling your information or selling access to your computer systems, also by ransomware, as we mentioned a little bit. The longer they stay in a network, the more money they make selling access or selling the information. They also, because of that, go to great lengths to stay hidden. If your computer is compromised, you won't necessarily know it unless they want you to know it. In the case of crypto ransom or ransomware, they want you to know that they encrypted all your files. Please pay.
Right.
If someone clicks on a link in a malicious email, that system needs to be considered compromised. The sooner the employee reports that they fell for it, the sooner it can get removed from the network, the sooner or the less money they make, the smaller breach you will experience. The problem with this is that people tend to be prideful to a fault. People don't like to admit that they got fooled. A quote, I believe, from Mark Twain is, "It's easier to fool a person than it is to convince them they've been fooled." In whatever staff training is conducted, it has they have to stress the point that everyone is vulnerable to these phishing attacks. Even a security professional like myself could fall for an attack. They can make them very convincing. They can do your research to provide any sort of cover story they want. Reporting that someone fell for it should be commended. Falling for it and hiding it puts the whole organization at an unnecessary risk. The people that I worry about the most are those that think they would somehow magically know whether or not it's a phishing attack. While some are pretty obvious, they can be very convincing. A person that thinks they would not fall for it is also a person that would have too much pride to admit they would fall for it, or if they did. This is the modern-day con artist. I don't think anybody is smarter than a con artist. They have been working at it for years. This is just the next medium that they are using to run their cons. Early reporting in this is absolutely crucial.
That's a great point. And, that speaks to something that you've said throughout this entire presentation, which is that there's a technological side to your security, but there's also that human side that you need to address as well. And I just couldn't agree more with you about the importance of security. Every organization, but, particularly healthcare providers in this context, you just can't assume that your staff know those security basics of, what is strong password policy, for example, or in this specific case, what do you do if you accidentally fall for malware? And as our guest was saying, time is of the essence. So if if you're not training your staff on that, I certainly would urge you to do so. We include that in our Hipaa training at Format Approved because we think it's important that some of these basic computer security issues be addressed in any Hipaa training, because you just can't assume that people know that this is how phishing works, and if you click on the link, there's no shame in it. You need to report it right away, because the faster your IT people can get on it, the less damage they do. So I love that you mentioned that, because I think it's so important.
One little tidbit that I don't think people realize, everybody knows the classical Nigerian prince phishing attack.
Right.
The one, you have a rich person in Nigeria trying to get some money. They'll give you a lot of money if you just send them some money first to free it up so they can transfer it. It's so obvious that people have thought that, phishing attacks, easy to detect them. Those ones are obvious for a reason. They intentionally make them obvious to detect. And this is the part that people don't realize. They're pre-screening. Those that are smart enough to know that it's obviously a scam are those that are too smart to fall for the rest of the con. Those that click and respond are the ones that are gullible enough to continue the con and likely give them money.
So explain a little bit more on that front, because I'm not sure I completely understand. So the most gullible people will fall for the Nigerian prince thing. Okay, that's one group.
Yep.
Then there's another group that says, I know the Nigerian prince thing. I'm not going to do that. How does it help the malicious actors for them to be pre-screened in that way? That then they know that they need to use a better attack on them or something? That
they don't waste their time on people that won't give them money.
Oh, I see. So it's sort of like a quantity game. That if you're not going to fall for it, then you're going to be too much trouble to crack anyway. Is that sort of the idea?
Right. I'm not going to waste another response on someone that won't fall for it. They send so much email out there. They only want to focus on the likely targets.
Right. And that is a great point too. You've mentioned this a couple times, but I think people need to appreciate just how much, it's just an incredible volume of phishing email is out there. I don't know if you have numbers on this, but it's just mind-boggling how many phishing attacks are sent out,
I do not have numbers, but I have seen spam filters report 90+% spam filtered from organizations.
Wow, that's incredible. So at least in some cases, 9 out of 10 emails to the organization are actually phishing attacks of some kind, or at least potentially. That's amazing.
In that case specifically, spam, some portion of it is phishing.
Right.
A large portion of it is simply junk email advertising that goes to everybody.
Still, 9 out of 10 emails are not wanted. Let's put it.
Right. Absolutely.
Yep. Yeah, okay. So anyway, but like I think of the example of the Target breach is that's I think a very illustrative example because that all started with just a blast phishing attack, at least from what I've read, that was sent out to many different, email accounts, and they happened to get into this HVAC company. And from what I've read, it doesn't sound as if they were actually targeting Target in the beginning. They were
Right.
just sending out phishing attacks, and then they realized that they had a backdoor into Target because this HVAC company was a vendor of Target's. And then they knew that they had hit like, the jackpot. They had this great backdoor
Right.
into this huge organization.
Yeah, I gotta think that the faces on them were pretty classic or pretty epic when they realized what they had access to. But that
Yeah.
jives with the reading I've done on it. Is it was just an HVAC vendor that got compromised through some phishing attack, and they were in the system and then found what they had access to.
Now, obviously, Target had its own security issues, problems that they needed to deal with. But still, that's how it
Yep.
started. It's pretty amazing. All right. Well, we have
Yep.
time for questions from our audience. We have a few questions already, and I certainly have some more questions for our expert. So I hope you'll stay with us for this question and answer session. If you have any questions that you haven't asked yet, type them into the chat area, but we'll start with those that we have already. All right. So I'll read off the question, and we'll let our expert answer it. Okay. Question about a hosted app inside an AWS VPC, which I don't know what that is, and
Amazon Web
HTTPS.
Service.
Okay. Versus HTTP. Obviously, calls to the app from a browser or mobile app need to be over HTTPS, but would a vendor need to have calls internal to the hosted VPC over HTTPS as well? I hope you understand that question a little better than I did.
Yep, I think I do. The AWS VPC, the Amazon Web Service
Ah,
virtual private computer, I believe it is. I haven't worked with Amazon's web service, but it's
interesting.
dealing with their virtual structure.
Okay.
Calls from the web client, he's right, or the asker is right, to that web service or the hosted virtual computer need to be over HTTPS. There are other specifications beyond that. If you want to get into details, disable SSL, enable TLS 1.1, 1.2, but that's more technical detail.
All right.
Calls internally from AWS server to AWS server, in my opinion, encrypting that doesn't add much of a layer of security at all. Amazon Web Service, the network over there, they've carved it out so you can't see another hosted client's servers. So another hosted client servers aren't going to see your communication either. If they do, they're doing it in a way that's taking advantage of some flaw in Amazon Web Service. If such a flaw exists, they've got access to the hard drive on that hosted desktop anyway, that hosted virtual computer anyway. So I don't see how it adds any security to encrypt from AWS to AWS, the network communication, at a fundamental level anyway.
That's interesting.
The only point that comes to my mind is that of the NSA recent revelations, relatively recent anyway, where they could tap the communication links between data centers without accessing any information within the data center. So if you wanted to prevent that type of an attack, encrypting the communication would benefit actually. But outside of that, I don't see any benefit.
That's an interesting point. I'm laughing just because, I don't believe that it's actually a breach if the NSA steals your data. I'm not sure what the rules would be on that, but they're not supposed to be stealing your PHI anyway. So I
Yeah,
hardly think
I actually, yeah, I think it would be hard to prosecute, but by letter of the law, it would be unauthorized access,
yes,
wouldn't
you're right. I
it?
guess
So,
it would be, but that would be quite an interesting situation. Let's just put it that way. If it ever came, what would
yeah,
happen is no one would ever hear about it, of course.
right.
Okay, so here's another question for you. Talk about auditing what your BAs do to assure that they are proving compliance to those they work with. Okay, so that question's a little general, but I guess maybe I'd frame it a little bit for you and say, how can cloud hosting potentially help you with business associate relationships? I know that the cloud provider is going to be a BA themselves. Are there any comments you'd like to make on that?
Really, it comes down to working with that cloud provider's security team to coordinate that audit. You really have to run an internal audit, essentially, of your own organization on a periodic, likely annual basis. Part of that audit should include any of your hosting providers or any of your vendors at all that have access to PHI. Accessing or auditing your cloud provider can be difficult because you don't see a lot of it. Some cases you may not be able to go and visit all of it. But getting information directly from the service provider or seeing the certifications that they have and reviewing those in detail is really where you have to go in assuring that they are staying compliant with Hipaa and any other compliance for that matter.
All right, well, thank you for that answer. But we've got more questions that we're going to get to, and we've got time left. I just want to mention before we go on, though, that if you're interested in learning more about the services that Netgain provides, do feel free to go to their website, www.netgainhosting.com. All of the cloud services that our expert Charles has been talking about are provided by Netgain. And I'll ask another couple questions, and then I want to ask a couple questions about Netgain itself, if you don't mind, just to learn more about some of the services you can provide. But first, let's ask a couple more questions from the audience or share them with our expert. The next one is, what is the best way to audit for meaning? I assume they mean meaningful use. And then this seems almost like a second question, but how do you know all access has been reported, especially when it is in the cloud? Now, you said before that audit logs would still be something in the EHR generally. Is that correct?
Yep, the EHR should still be maintaining an audit log of all of the ePHI that's accessed. Depending upon the EHR that you use, some of that ePHI may be stored in the file system. So ensuring that the file system is additionally logging access to it is a very good thing to do. Auditing the access then can either rely on the service provider giving you the information you're asking for, or having the service provider give you access to do your own self-audit. Depending upon your technical experience and the thoroughness of the audit, one would go one way or the other.
And I got to say, a critical point here is that you also, as in all of the other things we've discussed today, you've got to have that administrative policy commitment to actually review your audit logs. And OCR has been very explicit about this in discussing some cases where there have been cases where people have suffered a technological failure where, it can happen. It wasn't a cloud solution. It was something that they were running themselves. But then they had 10 months of unauthorized access to their PHI because no one ever reviewed the audit logs ever. And so then, and if they had looked, and OCR said this when they find them, they said if anyone had ever looked at the audit logs, you would have immediately seen that you had a problem, but no one ever looked. So it really is important that people make that commitment. Part of it is the technological ability to record the access, of course, but I think where things break down more often, frankly, is that people just never really look at those audit logs.
Sure. For our on-site video surveillance, I have a task that recurs on my ticket board every morning. Make sure we've still got video for today and yesterday. Make sure that the cameras are still online and recording, and it applies that same way to any EMR audit system. If they would just have a daily task of check to make sure you've got recent logs,
right.
Check to make sure you've got an old log, things like that.
Well, I hope people take that advice to heart, because that would be a great way to do it. Just make it part of your routine, set reminders for yourself, because it can really save you a lot of trouble. It's analogous, I would say, to the malware scenario you described, where time can be so essential.
Absolutely, and if anybody does go out and find that their audit system hasn't been auditing, their company could buy them lunch and come out ahead on this lunch and learn.
No kidding. All right, well, let's ask another question. And I like this one because this cuts right to the heart of the cloud, you could say. Are there any HIPAA requirements that prevent vendors from storing records and images, so PHI essentially, overseas? Could you address that issue?
That is a good question. I haven't seen any opinion leveraged or guidance leveraged in that question specifically, but it has been a reason that I've advised against Google and in favor of Microsoft Office 365 for those email hosting. The reason being that Microsoft, I think, has made more statements about hosting all of your data within the U.S. And Google has explicitly stated that they can't guarantee all of your data will stay in the U.S. While they could be HIPAA compliant across seas, if they aren't, I don't know how you could prosecute them. So I'm leery about that one. I don't have a good answer for you. I haven't seen anything yet. It's probably, unfortunately, going to come down to case law. When a breach happens across seas, how does the court system handle it?
That's really interesting because, I agree with you. I've looked into this question myself before, and I've not been able to find anything but opinions, and not opinions from the government, just sort of people weighing in on it. And, I know of organizations that do this. Of course, I won't name them, but I know of a particular organization that collects PHI, and it winds up getting stored in the UK. So it's outside of the United States. Now, they say that all of it's HIPAA compliant and everything, so they're still following U.S. law. Obviously, any company that's providing services in the United States has to comply with U.S. law. But you raised this interesting point that if the data is overseas, I mean, it does seem to raise some fuzzy legal issues. So,
yeah, at least in the case of it being in the UK, it's a U.S. partner.
Yeah, but it could be, who knows, it could be in Sudan for that matter, although I doubt that they do a lot of cloud hosting, but you never know. Well, let's take just a moment, and I'd like to ask you just to tell us some about Netgain, because you've talked about all of these technologies, and I know that you all provide them and do it well. So tell me a little bit more about how Netgain can help folks.
Yeah, so our typical environment in a hosting arrangement, we do offer the hybrid, the on-premise, and the cloud-hosted options. Our typical environment is that cloud-hosted environment where every client gets their own dedicated section of a network. They get their own domain controllers and any other servers that are needed to run any applications that they need. Application whitelisting, antivirus, firewall, spam filter are all included on that. The connectivity to the data center from the client site, we have multiple points of presence around the nation, so there are a lot of options for us to get relatively low-cost connectivity to that point of presence, and then it's backhauled over other private network connectivity to our data centers. That provides a nice cheap way to get good network connectivity to us. Full staff, so we manage a lot of the support requests, everything from, I like to say, how do you bold a word in Microsoft Word to I need a file restored from last Tuesday at 3 p.m. The granularity in there is sometimes a question. Maybe it only has the previous night's backup, but if it's a more recent request, there are other backup systems that provide some recovery options.
Well, that's something I hate to interrupt. I just want to say that's something we didn't really talk about very much, is the incredible backup advantages to doing this.
Yeah, absolutely, because the cloud providers have to back up all of the data. And if they miss any client's data, there's a big issue. So there are a lot of controls put around that to ensure that all backups are succeeding on a daily basis.
Well, go on. I didn't mean to interrupt, but that's just such an important advantage.
Sure. And then access to the multiple masters, as I like to call them. A lot of people are specialized in different areas. So whether it's SQL Server that you need expertise, help on, or Exchange Server, or you name it almost. We've got someone on the staff that either knows something about it or knows a lot about it.
Well, I'll just say that I think, NetGain, thank you so much for being on this session, but whether it's NetGain or another cloud service provider, that I really think more people are going to move in this direction as word gets out about the advantages that come with it. And, as people become more comfortable, I think, with moving more into the cloud than they do. I think a lot of practices are using cloud services a little bit, but I think if they realize what they could gain by moving more in that direction, more of them would do it. So I just
Absolutely.
there's and when it comes, we didn't even talk about things like disaster recovery, where it just is such a huge advantage for you if you've got a cloud operation because you satisfy those HIPAA disaster recovery requirements much more easily by doing it that way. There's so many things we can talk
Absolutely.
about. In
We'll
fact,
talk about that one next year.
yeah, there you go. In fact, we're almost out of time, but I want to ask one question that's sort of related to that. That's kind of an interesting question for me. And if we didn't get to your question today that you've typed in, we will provide that to our expert. So he'll talk to you after the session anyway. But the question I wanted to ask was, you talked about thin clients before, and I've heard other folks talk about the possibility of using desktop as a service with, sometimes they're called zero clients, where there's basically no local storage of data once that machine is turned off. Could you speak more to that and talk about, what the options and advantages and disadvantages are potentially?
Yeah, so thin clients versus zero clients. Zero clients are relatively new, maybe 3-4 years, if I'm not mistaken. Thin clients are just effectively really small computers. They've got a smaller processor, typically lower RAM, typically a very small hard drive. Zero clients have removed even more of those components and rely on that hosted remote desktop for almost everything. Benefits on both the zero clients, obviously there's nothing on the local system to worry about. Thin clients also have an option to schedule a daily reboot of the thing, and on every reboot, forget everything that was learned on the previous session, which gets them sort of to that zero client paradigm.
Well, I just think that is so tantalizing, is the word I'm going to use, because it solves so many of your security problems as a provider if you don't have PHI stored locally once that system is purged or turned off or whatever. It just seems really appealing to me if you can make it work.
Yep. Last thing I'd say is I agree. I think every company should be looking to a cloud hosting provider just for the economies of scale and better security. There are disaster stories that I've been present in or aware of where the hosting provider did not fulfill promises. So I say do your due diligence before you migrate anything.
Certainly.
Ask for references, check up on those references, and make sure it's going to be a good fit. Don't go with the lowest bid.
Yeah, make sure that you choose the right service because you will have a lot riding on it. But if you do choose the right service, it can make your life so much simpler. And so this is something that I try to emphasize in our HIPAA discussions with folks, is that the cloud can really make your life easier. You want to do it the right way, obviously, but if you do, it can really be to your benefit. Well, Charles, we're out of time, essentially. I want to thank you so much for joining us. It's a real pleasure to have an expert like you who can help us understand these issues better.
Absolutely. I enjoy doing them.
Well, I hope our audience enjoyed the session as well. Based on the questions, it looks like they did. If you think of a question after we're done, you can email it to us at formed@formedapproved, and we'll pass it on to our expert. We're always happy to do that, and we'll provide all of the questions to him as well. Do go to netgainhosting.com if you're interested in their services. They're one of those organizations, I would say, that I think is worthy of your trust in this area, so check it out. If you need training on HIPAA, for example, or meaningful use, or PQRS, all of these reporting programs, you can get it from us by going to www.formedtraining.com. You can see our entire online catalog there, and all of it's up to date. I say that with some agony because we did get meaningful use up to date after they issued the final rule. It took a while, so everything is fully up to date on the standards. That said, also join us for our next Learning Lunch. You can click on the Learning Lunch button on our homepage at any time to register for the next session. You can also look at our upcoming workshops and more, and do click on our Content tab for our free blogs and columns. Thank you to everyone for joining us again. I hope you'll join us for the next Learning Lunch. I really enjoyed this session, and I hope you did too. Thank you so much.